Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on restorative justice implementation at the school district level, lessons learned from Denver Public Schools. My name is Dewana Nicole. I'm with Advancement Project, a national civil rights racial justice organization, and one of the members of the Restorative Justice Partnership, a coalition that includes Advancement Project, Denver Classroom Teachers Association, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, Denver Public Schools, and the National Education Association. And we work to strengthen restorative justice implementation within Denver Public Schools and provide resources for educators, community members, and school districts nationally. Today, we're going to be sharing some work in Denver Public Schools around how they began their journey around restorative justice implementation and what are some of the lessons learned along the way. Before we get started, as usual, I want to open us with a quote. We often discover what will do by finding out what will not do. And probably he who never made a mistake never made a discovery. And that is by Samuel Smiles. This particular webinar today is a series of webinars that we are hosting as individuals prepare for the opening of the 2018-19 school year. And just like all of our other previous webinars, you'll be able to find a recording of this and our other webinars on our website, rjpartnership.org. So in a bit, we are going to hear from Daniel Kim, who's the Chief of Staff, and Donna Cash, who's the Manager for Denver Public Schools Office of Student Equity and Opportunity. After their presentation, you will be able to ask questions. You can type your questions into the question box if you are joining on your computer. Unfortunately, if you are joining on your phone, we have no way of calling on you to ask your questions. However, you can send questions to my email address, which is dnicole@advancementproject.org. That was also included in your webinar registration link. Or if you have worked with me in the past and you know it, you can also text me your questions and I can read them to Donna and Daniel when we finish. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel Kim and Donna Cash from Denver Public Schools.
Thank you so much, Dewana. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donna Cash, and I am so excited to share the lessons learned from Denver Public Schools. As Dewana shared, I'm a manager here with our Office of Student Equity and Opportunity. I've been a committed employee of Denver Public Schools for the past 6 or so years, and look forward to sharing more about our work.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Kim, and I'm Chief of Staff with the Division of Student Equity and Opportunity, and I also lead our student discipline team and our student discipline reform team here. Before I came to the district, I was also I led the youth organizing work at Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, the community partner that really helped establish and build restorative practices in the district. So I'm also happy to sort of to answer any questions about bridging those that collaboration. Just really want to appreciate everyone being here in terms of restorative practices being what a journey that we've been on as a district, for which that Don will get into, for now 12 years. One of the first districts to really try to implement restorative practices in a systemic way, but certainly please, as we go through our history, please write down your questions and your thoughts as we engage with what has been a journey with a lot of zigs and zags and a lot of lessons to learn from as well as things that we're certainly proud of too.
Great, thanks, Daniel. So here's our focus for today. We're going to start as close to the bottom as possible. So ground zero, what and how did we begin discipline reform in Denver? Give you a bit of context. And then we're going to talk more about how did we move forward through this process, what shifts and adjustments that we've had to make, some highlights, because we really appreciate the work that we've done. We continue to learn and work hard to make sure that our students benefit from this practice around restorative practices. We say restorative practices. I recognize that many places may call it restorative justice, and so I will try to flip back and forth, but please give me some grace around utilizing restorative practices. And then lastly, we'll talk about what we're calling restorative practices 2.0, to continue the lifelong learning of doing this work well within our district, and how are we moving forward and improving our work. So please, as Daniel said, make sure you write down your questions. We look forward to talking with you. So starting at ground zero, as you see that caption, it says zero tolerance policies contribute to the pipeline to prison by pushing Black students out of school. And now that isn't just to say that Black students are only students that are pushed out, but I think starting at ground zero helped us. It was important because at that time, we were driven by a lot of the work that Padres y Jóvenes put in place. They pushed Denver Public Schools. Their influence around making a decision to make some change happen was really a big piece of this work. I wasn't around when Ground Zero started for reform in Denver, so I'm definitely going to tap into Dr. Kim to help kind of share this story. But from there, we had a lot of issues around disproportionality. We'll show you some data later that shows that we had well over 11,000 out of school suspensions happening at that time, which was significant on a 72,000 or so student base. And so at that time, we thought we were doing the right thing, just like everybody else thought they were doing the right thing, that if a student misbehaved or we perceived it as misbehavior, suspending them out of school was the way to get it done. And so as we began to be pushed a little bit by some very passionate, thoughtful, loving individuals through Padres y Jóvenes, the racial justice community organizer that is now our partner, we learned that maybe that wasn't the best way. We began to do some research and learn that really out-of-school suspension did not change the behaviors that we perceived as a behavior problem. And so it began. Our timeline starts as early as 2005, all the way up until now. The overhaul of the district's discipline policy, which is JKR, which you can find on the DPS website in our board policies. That overhaul, the initial overhaul began in 2008. The Intergovernmental Agreement, the IGA, which this agreement is between the district and the police, that specifies the role of officers in our schools. I think that came around in 2012-ish. In that time, and around that same time is when the statewide law that addresses the ineffectiveness of zero tolerance policies and required our schools to implement proportionate discipline practices came around at that same time. And so I want to give Dr. Kim a minute to just kind of dial in on that, because he was a part of that work.
And I think the reason this is relevant is because our understanding is that, many of you in the communities where you are, in the districts where you are, might be sort of having questions about how do we make these reforms sustainable. And part of the answer for us actually lies in the foundation that was created through this early, I would say it didn't even start as collaboration. So if you look at, this is just to say too about how hard it is to lay the foundation to be able to create this kind of collaboration. But if we look into the sort of the early history of where this work came from, the district was at one point in quite intense conflict with the community around these issues. Donna mentioned the reform of our discipline policy in 2008 that led to this policy JKR. That in 2008 was the outcome of a community-led, basically organizing campaign that lasted probably 4 or 5 years. And at the beginning of which, the district initially was not happy with the campaign and was not happy with being called out for racial disparities, was not happy about, the word school to prison pipeline being used. The police department as well, in the initial sort of negotiations around the IGA, walked away from the table as well. The teachers union too, in the early phases of this work, was not only not at the table, but was in opposition, as was the district and the police department. So this is just to say that something I'm sure that we're all struggling with on the ground, which is it's much, much more than just implementing a policy or saying we're going to do something, that there's a real need to sort of transform the relationships, and that often, you know, and certainly what we've seen in Denver is that, you know, the community really created that push and led the way, and it was uncomfortable at the beginning to be able to really to name what the issues were and be able to come to the table. But through this work and through that transformation of the relationship, really through struggle and through coming back together through differences, and then negotiating to sort of really say, okay, what are we going to work together on, and how are we going to codify those things into levers that will actually, you know, hold each of us accountable to, was really an absolutely necessary foundation to be able to drive us through, you know, this more formal kind of 12 years of implementation that we've been on as a path.
That's great. So what does this look like when Daniel kind of talks about the push that existed? I can tell you, even when I joined the district and began to experience some of the pieces of the puzzle, it was really uncomfortable. And being a district person and watching the community kind of push us to think about, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Not feeling connected at all to the community, and also trying to defend ourselves, because as educators and folks who love children, we thought we were doing the right thing, and to be told that you aren't, and believe that you're an expert too, and be told that you aren't doing it right, it didn't feel great. And so I can attest to the discomfort that our district felt as the community pushed us. But here are some highlights during that time. So beginning to become restorative. In 2005, we had a middle school who hired their first restorative practices coordinator. At that time, we also called our restorative individuals restorative justice coordinators. And then in 2006, using roughly $1 million from state grants, we began a pilot around restorative practices at one DPS high school and 3 of their feeder schools. And then in 2007, we expanded the pilot to include 4 additional in Southwest Denver. Now that $1 million in grants was significant because that's where we were able to gain the resources to actually hire restorative practices focused individuals to be in the schools. And at that time, it was also very the primary focus at these schools was diversion, a means to refer behavioral issues that often resulted in suspension, expulsion, or police referral to restorative practice or restorative justice coordinators for mediation. Instead of receiving tickets, students participated in victim offender mediation practices, which were facilitated by the restorative justice coordinator. So this time in our growth, we were highly focused in mediation and discipline and reacting to the behaviors and challenges that the school faced. So that's where we started. Very conference model focused, very much responsive, very much setting a foundation around the work, but it was narrow and it was reactionary. We wanted to get Padres Jóvenes off of our back a little bit. We wanted to respond to the pressure that we were feeling. You want to add anything to that, Daniel?
No, that's great.
Okay. So that was our foundation. And now we want to become more restorative. When you look at this photo, and I think this photo is very much telling of the pain and the challenges that you face when you think about putting handcuffs on little children, right? And that's what we understood as we began to build relationship with our community partner to resolve this issue more. And so how do we make here's some of the highlights and adjustments that we made. So like I said, in 2008, Denver Public Schools passed a groundbreaking discipline policy called JKR, and we reformed how we were doing behavior within our district. At that time, we actually named restorative practice restorative strategies as one of the main 3 interventions within our district. So administrative strategies, therapeutic processes, and restorative are the main things named within our policy. And then between 2009 and 2016, which all of it is lumped together simply because it is a process. It doesn't happen one way or another. At that time, we were paying for a company to come in and train on restorative practices. However, the district thought it most important to have an individual, so we invested in an individual who provided monthly district-wide trainings, and they focused on conferencing, restorative dialogue, some school culture building, but it was all managed by and taught by the district-level restorative justice, restorative practice coordinator. And so throughout the years, schools across Denver Public Schools began hiring restorative justice coordinators because the schools that were in our initial pilot were able to demonstrate success. And so from that, other schools began to be a part of it. What we also found is that once the funding ended, a few schools continued the work by finding creative ways to maintain the program out of their own school budgets, proving that while outside funding is certainly helpful and it can create very creative options and incentives for schools to do restorative practices, it's not always necessary for the implementation. What we know is that our educators want the best for our students. And if they can see results from the proper implementation of restorative justice, restorative practices, strategies, and practices, they will make a way to incorporate it into their work. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good way to kind of a good way to sort of piece together the buckets of the story is that the initial sort of pre-work phase was sort of the community really pushing the district to listen and to shift and transform and negotiate sort of a foundational piece, which was to change the discipline policy, the code itself, to become to really incorporate restorative practices into it, and then to begin. And through that same period, like right around 2008, was also in the middle of when we were then using state grants, which the community organization Padres had also helped us to go after that grant money as well to support it. And then, so we're changing the discipline code to become more to include restorative justice. At the same time, we're doing this multi-school pilot where we're seeding basically the first full-time restorative justice coordinators in about 6 to 7 schools over a period of about 4 to 5 years. And then from the successes that emerged and the buy-in that began to emerge from the schools that really dug in and adopted the culture as their own with that grant money and with those full-time coordinators, that was the seeds of sort of a consciousness that began to spread around why we need to do this.
Yeah, I think one thing that the push continued, and getting the district to listen wasn't an easy task, I would suggest. One thing that happened that is so memorable for me was that Padres y Jóvenes and some other communities would support what they called an accountability report. And the accountability report was really tough because Padres with the data that we sent to the state on a regular basis, they would analyze the data and give very detailed account of where we were disproportionate, how we were utilizing out-of-school suspensions, how we were utilizing referral to law enforcement. And so listening was really a big piece of this work. And we listened better when that data was put in front of us, very detailed, to give us insight on where we were making mistakes, right? Where the disproportionality, where you have 13% of our organization being African-American students, but over 40% of the out-of-school suspensions were represented by African-American students. So that was something that we had to open our eyes and our ears so that we can make change happen. Do you want to talk about the accountability report, or?
I think we can go on.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's just, sometimes, we in the district, not just within our discipline work, but within our other departments and functions, can tend to fall into this pattern of, the community pushes us, and then we respond, and then we say, okay, we've got it from here, and we'll just kind of go with it. But what Don is talking about is a process where we have kept ourselves engaged, and the community has not let us go from being engaged around accountability in the best sense of the word.
Absolutely. So what we've learned is that restorative justice, restorative practice is more than just an intervention. And we learned that due to the fact that disproportionality continued and in some instances continues to challenge us. It's not all good, it's not all roses for us trying to figure this process out. We continue. We've made great gains in this, but our African American students in some instances continue to be disproportionately suspended out of school, and our students with disabilities also have some disproportionality, and we have to pay attention to those things. So our marginalized students is an area where we were able to learn that there's more to this process of being restorative than simply being reactionary to the process. So Restorative Practices 2.0, this is what we want to call where we're going and how we're moving forward. So that picture that you see in front of you is our whole child work. And so Denver Public Schools is probably one of the early adopters of whole child work as a large urban school district. We also continue to improve our restorative practices work and attack the continuing disparities that exist in our schools and our communities. And so over the past probably 2 or 3 years, we've put time into figuring out what does it mean to be a whole child district. And so we had committees come together. The committees included the community, of course, staff from our district, and our students. And we're really proud of the student involvement in determining being a whole child district, because although we know that children who are healthy, supported, engaged, challenged, and safe, that those things help children survive in their classrooms within our district, our students are the ones who really push the message around having socially and emotionally intelligent as one of the core competencies of our whole child work. That is critical when you think about students felt like all of those other things are things that we as the district should do for them and probably will do for them, but they also wanted to learn and drive their social and emotional intelligence. And I share that because I think that's really formative for us as a district, and it's really formative to our restorative practices work. So this lifelong learning and moving forward, where are we and what have we been doing since? So in 2014, as part of all of the listening, learning, feeling beat up, but also recognizing responsibility, the Collaborative of Racial Disparities in Discipline, which is a collaboration between the University of Denver, the Denver Classroom Teachers Association, DPS, Padres y Jóvenes was created. And so that team was brought together for a number of reasons. I wasn't a part of the creation of that. However, I am able to rely on lots of the data and information that team put forward. So there were reports and articles and data put forward in a way that helped solidify the work around restorative practices in our district. Can you speak a little bit more to the collaboration?
What happened at that point there was that Padres and the teachers union had begun talking about possibly collaborating, and certainly the district was always in conversation with the union about issues around student discipline. The district also had a relationship with Padres that we've talked about, and the district had also had a research partnership with a wonderful colleague named Professor Yoli Anyan at DU. And we thought that basically it would be really important. We were in a place where the relationships and the desire to collaborate to have this greater impact on disparities, we wanted to have a space where we all came together rather than meeting sort of in one-off or sort of one-to-one type meetings. And this has really became the basis for the next evolution of the restorative practices work that Donna is about to talk about, was just first creating a space where a space of relationship that we hadn't had before, where we all sat at one table every month and talked about how do we want to move the needle on disparities leveraging each of our own respective roles, and also being very honest about the things that we don't agree on.
Thanks. What I would say is that DPS, so in 2015, that collaboration extended a bit, and we added our national partners, National Education Association and the Advancement Project, who also have been so influential in this work. We're a committed partner in this collaboration, and it's essential to the continued support for restorative practices in our district, and is essential to our national recognition and exposure. We're really excited to share with you where we are and where we've come from, and hopefully where we're going. I'm from the South, and I haven't experienced this ever. I came from Florida, and so experiencing restorative practices in this way as a way to engage our community, as well as engage a better experience for our children when they learn, has been a real privilege. And so we feel privileged to have the connections between the community and national, just because that way we can begin to help students across the country, not only within Denver Public Schools. And so as part of that work, we have been able to launch the school-wide implementation step-by-step guide, which is a system-driven process to give you systems and structures on how to take restorative practices school-wide. Another really proud piece of the work that we love to share is that the schools that were in our pilot continue to focus on restorative practices year after year after year. And because of the work that they've done, they've set the tone and the culture in their buildings to be restorative schools. And so from that, we actually have 3 demonstration school sites, and we were able to develop a visitation program from that as part of our collaboration with the Restorative Justice Partnership. And you're welcome to visit. I think the visitation is available, the visitation schedule and being able to sign up for that is available on the Restorative Justice Partnership website, and would love to meet you and welcome you to Denver so that you can experience the great work happening here. Recently, we had received a state grant to expand our work. Like I said, we've come so far and we continue to grow. Although we're in a growing state, we still have a lot of challenges around people seeing restorative justice as simply as an intervention. And so to continue that work and begin to build on the momentum, we received a state grant to expand and improve our implementation by building out a multi-tiered system of support framework for restorative justice or restorative practices in our district. And I think we have that available for you as well on the Restorative Justice Partnership website. And so this multi-tiered system of support really looks at it similar to what some districts may call RTI, which is
Response to intervention.
Exactly, response to intervention. So what are those universal supports? What are those targeted supports? And what are the intensive supports? And so we are figuring out how do we utilize restorative at the universal level, because the way that we've been using it over time has primarily been focused in the targeted and intensive. And so if we can really think through and develop the ways to do it universally, we truly believe that we can improve community and improve outcomes for children, which is our ultimate goal. And throughout all of this time, we've only had one dedicated full-time equivalent employee for the district for restorative practices. As I said earlier, back in 2005, we were probably about a 73,000 student district. Now in 2017, 2018, we were well over 92,000 students. So I think about 92,300 students. And we were able to add one district level coordinator last year as part of the state grant funds to build out this work. And so it's not easy, but it's necessary. And so the investment of focusing on people at the district level too has been important for our work. The other great piece of it is that schools make the commitment. And so across our district, we have schools who hire full-time restorative practices coordinators who work throughout DPS. We also have to thank our voters of Denver, because about 2 years ago, we passed some mill levy bond dollars, which were specifically put toward our whole child work and gave schools a little bit more access to do more work in social emotional learning, but they also were able to hire restorative justice employees specifically. And well over 50 of our schools decided that they wanted a restorative justice, restorative practices coordinator dedicated to their schools. And that's part of the great work that we're doing moving forward and improving. And so we know that restorative justice, restorative practices builds community because of the partnerships, because of the accountability that we learned. We can actually use this work to be proactive and preventative in our work, supporting culture and climate, as well as conflict and discipline. So to share just a little bit of our progress and our challenges. I hope y'all love the photo as much as I did. I think it's amazing. So, but we've had both, right? We have a lot of progress and we continue to have challenges that we focus on. So here's the data that I wanted to share with you. So if you look at the graph in front of you, back in 2006, 2007, you'll see we had 11,461 out of school suspensions. And then when you come down to 2016-17, we had reduced our suspensions to 5,499 out of school suspensions, which was incredible work. And it is all due to the hard work of not just restorative justice and restorative practices, it's discipline reform, it is listening, it is being in partnership with people who challenge you. It is being willing to listen. Where we are extremely excited, and although the numbers aren't for 17-18, if you look at our expulsions on the very flat line at the bottom, back in 2006-2007, we had expelled 167 students, and in 2016-2017, we had reformed and figured out the best way to communicate around expulsions, that we only had 33 children that we expelled for our district on 92,300 students. And so we're proud of that. I believe our number was a little bit higher this year, and we expect that. But we do know that we've done a lot of great work to help understand the best way to keep our students in school.
Just one thing here.
Yep.
I just want to emphasize too, just that green line that's going up at the top. I mean, these numbers are coming down at the same time as our student population is really growing. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is that if you map the community organizing campaign onto this timeline, what you can see is that JKR, we were pushed and negotiated with the community to radically overhaul our discipline policy in 2008. So if you look at that dot there, you can see that the suspension rates began falling for 2, and it's actually 3 and 4 years before that, that line has been dropping. And what you're seeing there is basically that the push from the community and that campaign that's happening since about 2004, 2005 is already creating the beginnings of that push. And a lot of those changes are things that you're seeing, that it's not just something that happens because you pass a law, it's something because you're starting to really listen to the community is what that's reflecting. What that makes me think about too is that when Donna mentioned how a lot of the work that we've done in the district to implement restorative justice has been done with basically 1 FTE. How could that have been possible without the community as a partner, right? I mean, how many, if all you did was try to push implementation from the top down into the schools, I don't know how many staff you would need to try to do that. But if the community is actually out there, and there's stories in the media every month about how, you know, the testimony of a student, of a Black student or a Latino student talking about how they were affected by, you know, being criminalized in middle school or being suspended. And there's all of this, not just pressure, but really consciousness raising and awareness raising that's going on, not just from internal district communication, but like throughout the whole public sphere of Denver. That's really what's helping to drive this change and what is a real foundation for implementation.
Daniel, I think you bring up such a good point. And if you look at between 2008, probably even 2009 to 2013, that drastic change in numbers, the accountability reports, and I want to come back to that. The accountability reports, and Daniel, I hope you can kind of give a little bit more color to it. They were truly influential. And so when I say accountability report, Padres y Jóvenes looked at our data, and then they actually put out a report on every single school in our district. Every school, which is really hard on a principal to be facing the data around what choices were made around discipline in their school and how it was impacting. And so, Daniel, if you could give a little bit more color about the accountability report, because I believe what a beautiful picture to say, let's put the community organizing on top of this data, because it wasn't just us by ourselves. The community would push us. Padres and their entire community organization would come and be in front of the building with signs and cameras and the news. It wasn't always pretty, but it was worth it, because I think our students are benefiting from it. So Daniel, if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Well, just to give a bit of what it looks like, I mean, from 2011 annually through 2016, the community would, Padres and Jóvenes Unidos would call on the superintendent and the district's leaders in discipline to a meeting in the community. So you'd have a room with, 100 community folks with the district representatives at the front, and a panel of youth and parent leaders from the community, basically grading the district, giving the district a D for racial disparities, giving the district a C for reducing out-of-school suspensions, giving the district a C for restorative practices. And then at the end, also giving recommendations that then actually the superintendent, after hearing all the testimony and hearing the analysis from the community and the feedback from the community, would actually sign on the dotted line of those recommendations to say, we will commit to taking these measures in the coming year, which would then become a process that drove a set of, that would in a sense become a scope of work for the discipline team in the district and the restorative practices team in the district to say, okay, this is our charge from the superintendent, agreed from demands from the community, and that then would hold monthly meetings with the community to sort of check on how we're doing on implementing these measures that we agreed to. Another interesting layer to add, sort of to look at this graph in a timeline for, is like the different phases. So that so we've relied on the community to really push us and be an accountability partner and a brainstorming partner on ideas for implementation. And then we've had a tremendous commitment from our own staff to sort of experiment with sort of what will work and what can we try. So like Donna said at the beginning, the big push was conferencing. So at the point of behavior referral to the office, to the dean, to trigger restorative practices there, and sort of how do we train other deans to do that. And then after that phase, we had a piece that I'm not sure we talked about, where in the middle, like basically between, after the state grant ended around 2010 and 2015 or so, when we began to sort of push to sort of expand restorative practices, the big strategy we had, so if the initial phase was, how do we get more RJ coordinators to do something that's not suspensions, right, in buildings. And then after that grant period ended and we saw the beginnings of a lot of buy-in, our staff really dug in around, okay, since we see this increasing buy-in, we've got these champions in the schools, how do we train a whole bunch of people? So for about 4 or 5 years, the big push was to train as many people as we could. As folks were beginning to buy in and say, okay, yeah, we'll hire a restorative justice coordinator, or we'll make a dean half-time restorative justice, or we'll hire a para who can run a restorative practices room, to provide the training to sort of support those folks that they staffed up to sort of support them in what that new role could be and how to do that role. And then, yeah.
And I think another thing that I want to kind of bring awareness is that that push didn't only help within our discipline ranks. I believe it also helped with our district as a whole. Who did we want to be as a district? So 7 years ago, we established core values. And those core values include student first and integrity and equity and collaboration and accountability and fun. But the one that makes the most impact, that aligns with this greatly, is the one around equity. And so our organization began to have the conversations about race and how it was impacted. And so we also are doing work around implicit bias and that foundation around dealing with the inequities that exist for students of color, for our LGBTQ students, for our students with disabilities. So this work isn't independent. It's not only about discipline, but we know that there's systemic challenges that we've created that made us think that it made sense to suspend 11,000 children at that time. And so now the work is, I don't want to take all of the credit from the work that our district has done, but I do believe that the community pushing us made us better across our district, not only with the practices of discipline. And so despite the great progress, we continue to have challenges prevail for us. So we've had widespread, so on the left side are what I would say is the progress, right? So we've had widespread adoption of restorative justice throughout our district. Our out of school suspensions and expulsions have drastic reductions. We have research that supports the harm of out of school suspension and the positive impact of restorative practices. And then we have the effective collaborations and relationships with the Restorative Justice Partnership, the University of Denver, as well as our community. But the challenges continue, right? We have a district that is local autonomy. So schools get to make the decision. They are our unit of change. And so sometimes benchmarking and figuring out how many restorative practices coordinators do we have across the district, I don't always know, because they are titled differently. No, not everyone is a restorative justice coordinator. Some of our deans of culture, some of our deans of student services, some of them are social workers, some of them are the actual principal and the assistant principal. So that data capture, those pieces are challenging. Fidelity is really challenging because we don't mandate restorative practices within our district. It is a choice. And so how do we utilize it? Outside of it being within our policy as a recommendation in our JKR policy, we do not have a mandate that a school has to utilize it. It is a strong suggestion. And disproportionality for African American students and our students with disabilities continue. And most challenging is that with all of the great work, a lot of our students begin to become successful, which is fantastic. We want all students to be successful, and we continue to have challenges with our opportunity gap. And so how do we continue to focus so that the things that matter most is our children receiving the education that they deserve and need for the successes in their life? How do we continue to attack that? And that's the conversation that we're having.
I guess I would just add here in terms of, disproportionality, something that I would love to talk about if folks have questions about is the difference between disproportionality and disparity. And so while we still have significant disproportionality for our Black students, there is sort of the difference between sort of what you could think of as sort of the under suspension of white students and then the suspension rates for Latino students and Native American students. There's still significant disparities, gaps between the treatment of white students and students of color. Students with disabilities, we think, is a tremendous sort of opportunity for us right now. We have a really amazing focus and energy that has emerged in our Board of Education around taking on special education and transforming special education for students with disabilities. And we see discipline as a really key piece of that. And in terms of the opportunity gap, something that we just always want to acknowledge as a as a sober kind of reality is that transforming discipline is never going to be enough on its own to end institutional racism. So we could have no suspensions, and we could have really great restorative justice coordinators in every school, but that won't necessarily on its own mean that, you know, students of color will receive, you know, the same kind of education and that we know our white students are receiving in a different way. And but at the same time, we know that we cannot get there to eliminate the opportunity gap academically without addressing sort of the discipline and school culture piece.
Okay. All right, so that's everything that we have from a presentation perspective, but we look forward to what questions you may have and answering those questions to the best of our ability. And I think we have just enough time to go into some detail with your questions. So, Dawana?
Yes, thank you both Donna and Daniel for that presentation. We do have some questions. And so just as a reminder for folks, if you have a question and you are joining online or on your smartphone, you can type your question in the question box. If you do not have, if you are joining on your phone, unfortunately, then I cannot call on you for you to answer your question. However, you can either email me your question or send me a text message with your question. And I just want to also emphasize, I think, you know, both Donna and Daniel have a lot of really great information. I know a lot of school districts out there are really trying to figure this work out. And Daniel's, you know, his background in community organizing also provides like a really great context on how, you know, the school district can get to a certain place. So our first question is, what were the distinctions between the schools that brought in restorative justice work and those that did not during the early years of your work?
That is a great question. You know, I think it was probably someone who was already connected to the community and wanted to try it at Cole. So at Cole, there was a young man by the name of Ben Carnes, and he knew something about restorative practices and so was willing to try it. And I think that was the initial, especially with the push from the community. I think he was able to say, I'll raise my hand. Here's this thing that I've heard about. We also had internally the individual who was our one FTE. He had come from the criminal justice background and had also heard about restorative justice from that perspective, and we had to begin making changes. And so that was the question, that was where it started. And I believe through those relationships and that information and knowledge is why the first school may have started, but the other adopters, I believe, again, when you think about communities wrapping their hands around their schools, the north side of Denver at that time had a very rich and continues to have a very rich Latino community. And to challenge and address the issues, this was an area where those schools began to step up. Do you have anything for that, Daniel?
Yeah. So actually, and there's a lot more information on kind of, we did a study about 5 years ago led by our university research partners at DU. And what they did is they did some, They studied what were the common criteria that really made a school ready to make that leap in a real authentic way. And, you know, they identified 4 factors in the schools that actually ended up becoming not just initial adopters, but deep sort of adopters of restorative justice school-wide. And those 4 things that were identified were, the first one was the school leader. Like, you cannot get to that level of deep buy-in across the whole school and implementation without a school leader who's deeply committed to leading the charge to change the school's practices and culture. Then you also needed to have staff buy-in. So in the buildings where this became a strong practice, you didn't see just one principal and like one RJ coordinator and then a whole bunch of teachers who didn't want to do it, or a whole bunch of teachers who were saying, you know, well, when it comes to that, I just send my kids over there and they take care of it in that office over there. You know, teachers were actually bought in, staff were bought in, educated, like social workers were bought in. The third one was continuous professional development, that the educator community as a whole had a commitment to professional learning and development on this. In one of our model schools, when you visit them, they'll talk about how, you know, they all take a day or two every summer to revisit their prevention and intervention practices and restorative practices. And then the last piece was that a lot of these schools have found a way to, with their own funds, basically hire a full-time restorative practices coordinator. I would say that the other piece that was that's kind of a way to think about kind of what makes schools ready is when, if you imagine that initial $1 million state grant that Donna talked about, you can picture it as like 6 or 7 seeds going into the ground. You know, that was the funding that went, sort of those seeds were full-time. I mean, what school would turn down a full-time person, right? Like a state grant comes along and says, okay, you can have a full-time person, you title them a restorative justice coordinator, and we have a person who'll support and train them. And of course, the schools all say yes, right? But at the end of the day, after 4 years, when you take that funding away, right, where are the schools that then say, you know what, when we started this journey back 4 years ago, we were totally about tough on crime, zero tolerance, like punish to change things. But what we've seen happen to how we've changed and how our relationships with students have changed, we don't want to go back. I mean, when you visit Skinner Middle School in the visitation program, that's one thing that, like Joe Walden, the social worker there, will tell you about, is where you'll hear from the original, like if James is there, he'll talk about how he used to be the discipline dean. And how after that first 4 years, somewhere along that way, when the money went away from the grant, they just looked at each other and they sat down at tables and started talking about, we're not the same Skinner Middle School anymore. And we never want to go back to the way that we were 4 years ago. Those are the schools.
Thanks.
Thank you both. So both Donna and Daniel have mentioned our visitation program. You can find a list of visits for the 2018-19 school year on our website, rjpartnerships.org, along with the report, the research brief that Daniel just mentioned. It's called Taking Restorative Practices School-Wide, Insights from 3 Schools in Denver. You can also find that under the Resources tab in our website, but I will also include it in the list of resources that we send out when we send out a recording of the webinar. And you can also find all previous webinars and their resources on our website as well. The next question we have, a challenge in education is that data is viewed as a club to beat up on educators. In your accountability report, do principals and staff now see this data as a useful tool, and has it improved outcomes?
What I would say is that initially, that was the viewpoint, that this was what it was. And I think over time, so we are not, the accountability report is not happening now. It was a definitive amount of time. I can't say it will never come back, but we are not under an accountability report at this time. I think it definitely helped principals and leaders throughout the district think about what is the data saying? And it wasn't about beating up on the educators. It was really about beating up on the policies and the systems and the practices. So we recognize that the individuals, the humans, are delivering through a system. And so I think initially it may have felt we were quite defensive. When he said a C and a D, I know that our superintendent, Tom Boasberg, as well as our chief, Dr. Eldridge Greer, would literally say, really, we can't get a B on something? Those conversations were really candid. And so, yes, there was that part, but absolutely throughout our district, we value data at a very high level, so much so we actually have within our system an equity indicator to determine where we may be over suspending students of color or the gender of our students in one particular area. So, because if we know, then we can be very present to how do we change it. And so, yeah, I don't think people feel as beat up anymore. It really is about how do we understand the system, and then how do we make positive adjustments.
Yeah, and I think, part of how does it change from feeling like a club to being something that feels like a really constructive piece of feedback? Definitely that started with the superintendent. So to have the community sort of put that pressure on the data that made it feel uncomfortable at the beginning. I mean, again, like I shared, earlier responses from the district were not to embrace that, to fight that club. And, we sometimes still see this in certain ways in other areas of our work, but sort of, our response can be defensive, right? We can say, we don't agree with that data, or is that data correct, or that's not the right data, or all the myriad ways that if we want to challenge and refuse to sort of that club landing on us, we can. But the superintendent made a very powerful gesture, Tom Boseberg, by saying, no, this is our data, and we want to be pushed by the community. And then to have that cascade down from the leader of the district through all the levels of supervision of schools has been huge. I would say, to the point now where reduction of suspensions is actually a goal that is built into the internal supervision of school leadership, all the way down through our instructional superintendents to our principals. So now we're at a place where the principals and the instructional superintendents who support them are, this data is what they review on a daily or weekly basis, and they don't treat it as a club. They see it as, no, this is our data, right? This is the mirror we use to look at our own practices to guide how we want to improve the experience and the outcomes for our children.
Thank you. And if you're interested in seeing what those accountability reports look like, you can go to Padres' website, which is padresunidos.org, and you can find them there. But we can also include the two latest ones, both the district and state level accountability reports that Padres has done in our list of resources, so you can see how they look. Our next question, you have two district-wide restorative practice coordinators. Do you have a district-wide implementation team?
For us, it's one and the same right now. The employees, myself as the manager, and then our two district coordinators are responsible for the implementation or the foundation of implementation across our district. As I stated earlier, we are a local autonomy focused district, and so schools make requests and we can go in and support them. When we think about implementation science from the very scientific perspective, it looks different across our district. And our school implementation guide kind of gives systems and structures that should be in place, but how do you use an implementation team to ensure the follow through of practice is something that I think we can do better. We don't have it in that very, and I use scientific because I know there's implementation science. We don't have an implementation team from that perspective. So it's myself and the two district coordinators responsible for that work.
Jonah, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the 4 or 5 major buckets of sort of the work that your team does?
Sure.
Around sort of the formal trainings that we run at the district, the kind of the on-site coaching that your team deploys out to buildings for, the sort of intensive, like the support around crisis conferencing when incidents come up, and then some of these more formal training programs that we've had, like the EARS cohort and the community of practice program for RG coordinators.
Yep. So Daniel kind of said it, but let me kind of go into when you think about the implementation of restorative practices at the district level. So having 2 district coordinators has enabled us to have a very clear training program that we're offering to anyone who in the district who wants to be trained around restorative practices. And because we set up the multi-tiered system of support, it actually has levels to it. And so there's the first level that's very much about community building through Circle. We had the advantage of having Dewana and her team ensure that we were trained around the Circle process in the very organic and natural way that we want to include students in our community. So we have that foundation, and that's our first training. And then we go to the next level, which is a 2-day training that we make available, and schools commit and allow people to be away from their building for 2 days to do this training. And that second tier of training is really the harm and conflict, those pieces of the puzzle that exist, and the healing that can exist in that. And then the next tier is a really intensive tier, and it's not overly intensive. It's just, how do we close the loop? How do we reintegrate children back into the system? How do we continue to build community when harm has been caused? And so that's the level of training that we provide across the district. And then those coordinators can support schools as schools request, going out to the school and providing full team trainings. They can support the restorative practices coordinator on site, and they can provide coaching. And coaching can be with the restorative practices coordinator or simply a teacher in their classroom who wants to do a better job of not referring a student out of the classroom, but being able to have really quick restorative conversations in the classroom, or practices that build community in the classroom in a great way. And then the high level conferencing and support, when a restorative practices coordinator may find themselves in a situation where they're not the best individual to manage a conversation at the school level, the restorative practices district level coordinators can come in and support. So maybe it's a conversation between the student and the assistant principal, and the restorative practices coordinator and the assistant principal have a certain relationship that it doesn't make sense for them to be the mediator within that conversation. Or if a really big fight happened on the campus and you need more than one person to come in and kind of really mediate those situations, the district level coordinators can go in and support that work. And so we can take it to different levels to support them. The other pieces of our work was, one, when I talked about the grant that we received last year, the EARS grant, which is the Expelled and At-Risk Students Services grant from the state that we received. It allowed us to really bring in about 15 schools and create a professional learning community with those schools for implementation purposes specifically. So what implementation practices are already happening at that school, and utilizing those areas from the report that you'll see on the RJ Partnership website. How does that look, and what does implementation look like for staff buy-in? Not only for the purpose of you get staff buy-in, but how do you gain staff buy-in? And so that cohort process was really influential in building out the work for our teams as well. And then lastly, for implementation, the restorative practices coordinators come together monthly to develop the community of practice, to get the continuity and consistency throughout our district to continue to build community.
All right, thank you. At this point, it seems that restorative justice interventions are more reactive than proactive. What types of preemptive strategies does a successful restorative school use?
What a great question. Thank you. Well, the first one that we believe has so much impact is the circle practice, and where you can do circle and how you do circle. It is one of what we find to be one of the most foundational ways to engage in relationship with one another without barriers, and keep us all on the same playing field, utilizing the talking pieces, not only so that the person that's talking can talk, but the individuals that are listening can really focus on listening. And so that is one of the major proactive ways to build community rather than simply reacting. Because what we know is being in relationship, we're less likely to harm each other. And so that's our most proactive position. Also, when you know someone, your assumptions about individuals change, and consequently, the equity and the bias begins to be broken down when you build relationship.
I would just add to that something that's really that has become a priority for us as a district is last year, our school board passed a resolution to make us a trauma-informed district. And we've been beginning to build and roll out a really great series of professional developments that we piloted last year for educators on trauma-informed practices that has a lot of integration with restorative practices. So that's definitely on the preventive end as well. I would say just one kind of tip that we've learned about in the process is that one way to kind of sell restorative practices on the preventive side to classroom teachers who may, if they don't even know what restorative practices is, or maybe they've heard something that, oh, it's this soft practice, or it's not, doesn't hold kids accountable, or they've had some bad impression of it, is to not even call it restorative practices. I mean, really, because on another level, we can talk about this as these are relationship building skills that will help you with your children, and classroom management. These are classroom management skills, right? Circles are also not something that you use just for discipline or culture situations. On the preventive end, they can be tied to curriculum. They can be integrated that way. The thing I would just want to emphasize too is that, to say reactive for us is not, I wouldn't want us to go too far the other way and sort of assume that if we use restorative practices as an intervention for suspensions, that that's somehow a bad thing. Because, what we're all really grounded in is that how harmful suspensions are. I remember one time, one really amazing educator sort of explained it to me this way. He said, as an adult, have you ever been in a meeting and been kicked out of the meeting, right? And what does that feel like as an adult? Imagine what that feels like to a child or to a teenager, right? And how much it damages trust and breaks the relationship, let alone all of the falling behind in school and not getting all the homework, like the classwork done and whatnot. But the message that lands inside the student's heart and experience of who am I and how am I seen at school? So to say that, we don't look at the phase of our work where we were doing conferencing and kind of restorative practices as an intervention as a bad phase. We're trying to sort of build on that and become, restorative practice can be much more than that. But if districts are in a place where we were then, and we still are for a lot of our schools, where restorative practices is that intervention that we're going to do instead of suspending, that is a really important step. That is a very powerful step to sort of the Padres Unidos, Ricardo Martinez, the director there, in one of our recent meetings, had this really powerful quote where he said, it's time that we put to rest that tool in our toolbox that we call suspensions. It's not actually a tool; it's a weapon, right? And we need to not have that. So just wanted to add that as well.
Thanks.
Our next question, who provided the training for the restorative justice coordinators and staff?
So the district level coordinators, the initial training would have come from one of an outside vendor. I don't have a name, that was so long ago. But the trainings that we offer internally have been developed over time and are provided to all of our teams from the district level coordinators. However, we, again, the advancement project brought in some trainers for the circle process specifically that has helped us significantly around the training. And then the skill sets of the individuals that we hire were kind of based in restorative practices already. And so we have not chosen a vendor per se to kind of continue, because there's only 2 of them right now. But yeah, we don't have anybody outside of our district that does our training.
And then I think part of what's really great about the strategy that Donna's leading with sort of what we're calling Restorative Practice 2.0 is the shift to, yes, we definitely need our central-based coordinators going out and training and coaching and providing structured progressions of PD, but we also want the schools and educators to be beginning to teach each other peer-to-peer. So the whole point of a demonstration sites program is, if you want to learn how to do restorative practices, yes, call us and we'll come and train you, but also go and visit with one of your peer schools. Like go principal to principal, go social worker to social worker, go student leader to student leader in those demonstration sites. We've also been experimenting with, in our restorative justice partnership, with sort of trying to set up these structured mentoring relationships between schools. And then definitely these sort of cohort models are all about establishing communities of practice, so that when you're in a building and you have questions or you want to reach out for some support, not only can you call the central office, but you can call the 12 other schools that were in your cohort. Or if you're an RJ coordinator, you can come to the next monthly meeting and talk to other RJ coordinators and think about a problem of practice.
And we've also, with those trainings, the great thing about this team that I'm so excited about is we're not just the experts, right? So every training has a facilitator's guide attached to it that they can take back with them, and they can implement the training just like she provided or he provided the training on site. So it's not about us holding all the information and the skills. It's about how we share it and giving folks access to it real time, as quickly and easily as possible.
Okay, so we still have a number of questions left, and I know we're running close to the end. What are some challenges from students you have faced while implementing restorative justice in schools?
Do you know what kinds of challenges from students are we talking about?
That was the way the question was written.
That's a tough one. I think it just depends on the situation. I would say for most students, it's a positive response to having a restorative conversation and the opportunity to share their side of the story. Restorative practices, what we find is that it gives students voice. And if we can figure out how to hear from them, then it allows us to give them access to how do they handle a challenge for themselves in a different way. And that's what we've learned. So part of the visit process is that you also hear from students, and they're super duper candid about their experiences around RP prior to, or restorative practices prior to it happening. So I remember one young lady telling a story. She said before restorative practices, she would raise sand regularly and lose a lot of friendships and relationships because of it, that she didn't know how to handle conflict and she didn't care how to handle conflict. But because of restorative practices and having conversations and given the tools to have conversation, now she settles issues differently. And not that she keeps a whole bunch of friends, but she knows that she doesn't have to argue it out all the time, that she can resolve it a different way. And it doesn't only extend at school, it also extends at home.
So just to make sure that we're answering the other possible meanings of challenges from students. So another way that I understood challenges could be, what are some of the problems that students have flagged for us, especially youth have flagged for us around implementations in restorative practices. 2 big categories of that are when they come and tell us that in our building, it feels like restorative practice is really only for student to student conflicts or issues, and that it's not something that really goes 2 ways with the adults. And basically, I think, what all the educators and also community folks out there would probably know right away is that when students see that happening in their building, where they really see it as, well, RP is what is done to just us, and there's never any repair or resolution in terms of when the teacher or the adult might have been responsible for the conflict, they see through it just like that. and right away the credibility and the buy-in from students is gone. So that's a big one. The other challenge that we hear about from students is, who gets restorative practices and who doesn't, right? It's the same sort of thing, like who gets the counselor called and the mental health person called, right? And who gets the police called on them, right? Or who gets the suspension for the same thing? Those are, what we know and always acknowledge are sort of things that are affected by implicit bias and institutional racism. But that's another big challenge that students have raised. I think another sort of way of looking at challenges is definitely sort of where is it that in certain scenarios, restorative practices is generally not appropriate, and defining where those areas are. So two of those in particular are, when the police and law enforcement have become involved, sometimes restorative practices can put the student at risk. So that's a situation where we need to be careful. And certainly where there's a Title IX issue or an issue of, say, sexual assault or discrimination of some kind involved, to put two students together into a conference or into a circle can be re-traumatizing. And so we have to be careful with demarcating those areas for students where we're not going to use restorative practices.
Okay. San Francisco, Oakland, Minnesota, and Baltimore all have district-wide implementation efforts. How is Denver similar or different from them, and have you learned from any of their efforts?
That's a good question that you could jump in on, Dwana.
I think that's appropriate.
Okay. So I think through the work of the partnership, we've been able to, I think, really learn from what a lot of school districts or states are doing with regard to this work. I think one thing that is really beautiful about restorative justice is that there really isn't just one way to do it. You really do have to figure out what is going to work best for your school community. But I think there is a lot to learn from the way, San Francisco, for example, has a very large team of individuals at the district level that are, supporting the schools when it comes to implementation. The way Baltimore really emphasized a number of years ago on making sure that they were looking at the whole student and providing those wraparound services to young people. And obviously with Nancy Riesenberg in Minnesota, all of the great work that she has developed that has really fed into the school districts there. For St. Paul, for example, being able to support, have a position that is both funded by the teachers union and the school district that, supports, cohorts of schools as they are implementing restorative justice for the first time, developing plans and, in the future, developing training for the staff at those schools. I think, every school district is doing it differently, but they've really been able to figure out what works best for their school district. And I think, I think every school district is still learning, right? I would say I don't think any school district thinks that they have it all figured out or that they're perfect. I think, we're all still learning what to do and really still learning from each other about, what has worked and what hasn't worked. I think that's why, spaces like this where districts are, open and honest about, the work that they've undergone and even some of the challenges and lessons learned that they faced, so they could help other school districts who are just beginning their journey. Or I know a lot of school districts that started a journey and are now in a place where they are kind of recalibrating the work that they're doing. And I think to Daniel's point earlier, a lot of places, I'd say, I think San Francisco really did start from a place where they were really interested in trying to figure out, how do we build supportive school communities? But many districts do start from a place that is very reactionary. We want to use this because we do not want to suspend. And while, that's helpful in one way, what it doesn't do is it doesn't speak to that overall philosophy of restorative justice, where we are really trying to change culture and climates in our school to make our school communities warm and welcoming places for our young people, where we really are seeing them as unique individuals, and meeting them where they are.
Could I add one thing to
Yeah,
that?
for sure.
Well, I think one thing that I would be remiss not to sort of to acknowledge in terms of what's been special about our work here too is, and I think we share this with Chicago, is, you know, a really great relationship with our teachers union in this work. And again, we didn't start that way, you know, over 10 years ago in terms of our relationship in this work to the teachers union, but DCTA, Denver Classroom Teachers Association here, has really become a partner with us in the work. And it's so essential when it, as a barrier to implementation, if when we were in a place where we were at odds with our educators, it's a totally different condition under which to try to implement. And we're so glad to have that partnership. At the same time, as we know, again, it's not perfect, and the same with our partnership with Padres. But and I think if you were to talk to our colleagues in Chicago, there'd be some insights from their work with their union as well.
Yeah, I would agree. The partnership is the partnership with the community and the teachers union is so critical to where we are and who we have become, because we're all willing to have pieces and parts of the conversation that are critical to the success. And so I think the partnerships across those cities and states as well, when I meet those folks, you can tell the vibe. Right, there's a vibe and a connection that I've felt when I meet with folks in Oakland, folks from Minnesota, folks from Chicago, and so I think the connection is what Restorative brings us together in that space. And so, yeah, the uniqueness though is simply relationship with our community and with the teachers union, I think.
And for whoever the folks are who are out there from these cities and districts and states, you know, we'd love to be able to talk about maybe trying to compare notes sometime, or some structured way that maybe Duana could help facilitate us pull together, maybe at a conference coming up soon in Denver, maybe.
Yeah, sounds like a winner. All right.
Yes, thank you, Daniel, for that. If we should actually talk more about that, maybe trying to host a way for folks to be able to come in and learn from each other from the district level. I think that's a really good idea. So we still have like 3 questions, I think. Just want to try to get to them before in the next 5 minutes.
Okay. Could you read the 3 questions?
Yeah, you want to read all 3?
They're very different. So, in a local autonomy district, how do you ensure that equity opportunity gaps are addressed so that bias is not a factor in school staff using restorative justice?
Okay. Do you want to go one by one, or do you want to just read 3 and then we'll try to kind of?
Yeah, just let's go one by one to make sure that we're, fully answering the questions.
So one of our divisions within our district is called Culture, Equity, and Leadership Team. And that team literally deals with culture and bias and a lot of those sensitive pieces of the work. They also are responsible for our leadership training across our district. And so people are not left to their own brilliance to make decisions on how the training and how the information comes to them. It is, again, when I talked about the core values of our district, one of our core values, and those core values were pulled together not by our superintendent on his own, but by, I think, 1,000 employees across our district came together, and those were the core values that were chosen, and equity made it to the list. And so it is a very important piece of our work. And in the climate that we experience, I think it's really important to be able to simply have the conversation. And so that's my best answer right now.
I would add 2 pieces to that. So definitely what Donna was talking about in terms of collaborating between our departments. So our Culture Equity Leadership Team is one of them that does all the equity and bias trainings in buildings, but the other one would be our Curriculum Instruction Division. So they're leading a whole initiative around culture responsive education and culture responsive teaching that we're trying to collaborate with. So that's how a coordinated central push to the schools is something that is important. And the other piece is that what sort of one of the big kind of mechanisms for bias in a local autonomy district is data. So that piece of like whether that's the community driving accountability reports or whether those internal accountability reports and feedback that's happening, schools, if they're not going to be held accountable to a central mandate, if they're holding themselves accountable to their data when they look at that data regularly.
And the other piece is our service and our relationships. Mm-hmm. And so our ability to respond to what schools are asking for and what they need is really critical. So providing them great customer service, as well as having respectful relationships with our schools to deliver on what they're asking for when it comes from the central office.
Okay, so Donna, earlier you mentioned that you do not mandate that schools implement restorative justice. So this is, I mean, I think a lot of school districts are struggling with this, right? The superintendent may be saying, I want all schools to have this, all schools are going to have this. That kind of takes away from the philosophy of restorative justice. And so can you talk a little bit about why you don't mandate that every school do this?
Well, it's part of the work that, our schools, they have the best interest at heart for our students, and we hire really great professionals to lead our schools. And part of that is them making the best decisions for their school, so to speak. However, I think Daniel said it earlier, we've planted seeds, and those seeds have grown, and you can see the fruit of the labor. And people see restorative practices as an actionable practice that resolves an issue that most educators agree that out of school suspension does not do anything positive for our children. And so that is where I would say mandate. It is in our discipline policy. And so when people read that, they see restorative as a strategy. The other strategies don't have as much actionable process or practice. And so it's easy to say, well, let me try that strategy, since I would agree that out of school suspension doesn't work. And so, yeah, Daniel.
Well, I guess one thing that I would add there too is that if we want a real mandate, is that going to come from a policy, or is it going to come from political will? And in this case, the political will created the mandate, and we've all been under mandates that are sort of hammered down to us from above that we don't commit to at heart. And I would say that's really the key. Is you can find the mechanism, but at the end of the day, the real question about mandate is where's the political will for it. We do have a model that we'd be happy to talk about later in terms of the trauma-informed work. That one is starting as a more of a traditional policy mandate, like our board passed the resolution, and we're now trying to figure out a way to sort of spread trauma-informed practices throughout all our schools in the district. So we are heading down that path with that piece of work. So it's not to say that certainly in any other district that might not be your path. So we'd love to compare notes.
Yeah.
Okay, has there been any analysis on the impact students have made once they have graduated after having been exposed to restorative justice and conflict resolution skills, meaning in the broader community outside of the education environment?
So this one's a question you might want to weigh on, Duana, as well. But my understanding from our research partner is this is the area where there's tremendous opportunity and a need for research. And again, we'll just put the call out there to other folks who are in other districts who might want to explore doing this together. But this is an area where we're definitely trying to explore and study and make plans for how do we make this case and how do we do these studies. We have some of the political will within our own district now, and certainly there are really great researchers and research entities that are out there that want to support us with this. But right now, this is the cutting edge of research and restorative practices. Did you want to add anything to that, Duana?
Yeah, I don't know of any research that studies young people who were exposed to restorative justice in school and what happens to them after school. I do know of places and cities where they are, looking at like how do we provide those supports to our larger community that is inclusive of young people. So Chicago is a really good place where there is some partnering with young adults after who may have graduated from Chicago public schools or who may be disconnected from Chicago public schools, and even in some cases who are young people who are still attending school, but then they're also being provided services and have opportunities as it relates to restorative justice within their neighborhood community. So that may be a place that you want to look at, their restorative justice hubs in Chicago. Okay, we made it. Thank you. So before we end, I just want to say that so we will send out the recording of this webinar and the resources that we mentioned to everyone, and then we will post it on our website where you can find our visitation schedule and also a list of our previous webinars and their resources. For our closing, I just want to read something from Miles Davis. Sometimes you have to play for a long time to be able to play like yourself. So to all of you who are out there, engaged in this work, it's very important work. And we really need you, need strong leadership who are going to really kind of push the envelope and do the right thing. And so incredibly thankful to Donna and Daniel for the insights that they provided and for being so open and honest about what they have experienced in Denver. So thank you both.
Thank you.
And we will try to, I guess, think through, how we can with the conference that Daniel was mentioning, the NACRJ conference will be in Denver next year. And so thinking through ways where there can be some share out with other districts to talk through, some of the successes that they've had, and then also some of the challenges they may be facing and work through them collaboratively together. Our next webinar is, I believe, on August 28th, and that will be where we actually go into detail around, I'm sorry, it is not on August 28th, it is on August 29th, and during that webinar, we will actually go into detail around how union and community can actually work together with regard to restorative justice implementation. So, hopefully folks will be able to tune into that one. We'll be able to hear from the co-executive director of Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, Ricardo Martinez, along with Henry Roman, who is the president of the Denver Classroom Teachers Association. We'll also be joined by Harry Lawson, who's the director of Human and Civil Rights for the National Education Association, who will talk about what some other unions across the country are doing. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much.
Duana? Oh, you cut us off. If there are any folks from districts who want to come meet with us when they're here for NACRJ, please let us know.